Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos, and I'm a sociologist at John Jay College here in New York City. At this taping, New York and New Jersey are just a few days removed from violent bomb attacks. The suspect has been arrested. He's reported to have endorsed jihad, dismissed as a threat by the FBI in 2014 after a tip from his father. And the New York Times reports there is nothing in Trump's or Clinton's anti-terrorism plans that would have much effect or chance of stopping the bombings. Donald Jr. has been castigated for his post, equating our Syrian refugee problem to having a bowl of Skittles, that just 3 would kill you, and wondering if you would then take a handful. The Skittles company responded by saying, quote unquote, Skittles are candy. Refugees are people. We don't feel it's an appropriate analogy. The subject of how to prevent violence and terrorism will almost certainly be a major topic in the first presidential debate on September 26th. Increasingly, this is and has been at the level of gibberish and discourse in the country on a profoundly serious and important issue. I've invited a dear friend and one of the most respected international authorities on violence to the Radical Imagination to discuss his recent work and forthcoming book, Toward a New Theory of Personality. His insights into the dilemmas of modernity and his ability to discuss interpersonal and intrapersonal violence, homicide and suicide, along with collective and more political forms like war and terrorism, is groundbreaking work that has profound implications for policy, transformation, and the radical imagination. So thank you so much, Dr. Gilligan, for being here on the Radical Imagination. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for inviting me, Jim.
I'm just thrilled to be able to discuss your new work, what you've been thinking about your whole life and your activism in this field. So tell us a little about what you've been writing recently, and Toward a New Personality. Is that the name? That's the name of the book, right?
Well, I haven't. The last thing I decided on is the title of my book.
Okay. All right.
But I am trying to develop a new theory of personality.
Okay.
That I think can help to explain both what leads to violence and what leads to nonviolence, or the prevention of violence. And yes, as you mentioned, I have mostly concentrated up to now on studying individual or interpersonal violence, like homicide and suicide. And I want to take lessons I've learned from working with the most violent people our society produces to understanding how that can help inform us about the motivations behind terrorism and war, or in other words, the causes of terrorism and war and other forms of political and collective violence.
We should hasten to add that you were the head of the Department of Mental Hygiene in the Department of Corrections in Massachusetts for a number of years. So this is, as a psychiatrist, you worked with some of the most violent people, as you say, that we've ever produced in this country. So those insights have also led you to a more comprehensive attempt to understand violence in general and different forms that violence might take.
Yes. One of the main lessons that I learned about the causes of violence, or in other words, the motivations that motivate people to commit violence, is that there is one emotional cause that is necessary for violence. In and of itself alone, it won't cause violence, but it's always present in my experience when people commit acts of violence. And that is the feeling of shame and humiliation, the feeling of being disrespected or insulted or ridiculed, rejected, and so forth. When I would ask people why they had committed, I mean the violent criminals in the Massachusetts prisons and prison mental hospital, why they had assaulted or even killed somebody, they would almost always give me the same answer. It was because he disrespected me, or she disrespected me, or disrespected my mother, my fellow gang member, whatever it might be. And that sense of being disrespected is what I mean by being shamed and humiliated. But when people are humiliated as individuals, as the people I was talking with had felt in their own individual lives, they more respond with individual violence, homicide or sometimes suicide, or both. But when they're humiliated as part of a group, and they feel the whole group with which they identify has been humiliated, they are more likely to resort to collective or political violence. For example, after 9/11 in 2001, the first public statement that Osama bin Laden made was that these events, the bombing of the World Trade Center towers by planes and so on, were payback for what he called 80 years of humiliation and contempt toward the entire Islamic nation by the nations of the Western world, of which the United States was the leader, which is why they were
That was his
attacking
first
the
statement,
US.
basically.
His first statement.
Interesting.
So in other words, he was saying, we have been treated with humiliation and contempt by
As
you.
a people.
As a people. So we are collectively punishing you collectively as a people. They didn't care about who the individuals were, as long as they were Americans. It was an attack on America, not individuals, by a group of them, not just an individual.
So bin Laden may or may not have been humiliated, disrespected in his early childhood. That was almost irrelevant. But
Yeah.
at some collective level,
Yeah.
he felt that.
As a person, Osama was one of the wealthiest people in the Middle East. And wealth is one thing that tends to shield people
Right.
from the worst aspects of humiliation and contempt. I mean, poverty is what makes people more vulnerable to being treated with disrespect and feeling disrespected. So I don't think as an individual he was saying he was disrespected. It was as a Muslim representing the whole Muslim nation, as he called it. Of course, there is no such thing as one Muslim nation. I mean, there are many different nations that are Muslim. But he was talking about the whole religious grouping, Muslims as an ethnic or religious group.
There's a certain reality to that, right?
Yeah. And
That doesn't obviously
that doesn't
condone
excuse
what
it.
excuse her,
It doesn't
but-
say it's rational.
Exactly.
Yeah. But the other thing I would mention, though, is, there is some degree to which people can succeed in protecting themselves from being disrespected or humiliated, or at least rendering themselves less vulnerable to it, less hypersensitive to it. And that is, the more that people accomplish things that they can respect in themselves and that will elicit respect from others through, for example, constructive work or skills that really benefit the whole community, the less likely they are either to be humiliated or, even if some person or group does insult them, to feel vulnerable to that.
Brush it off to a certain extent.
And that's something which the leaders in the Arab and Muslim communities have said that those nations have not succeeded in enabling or giving an incentive to their people to achieve, namely a level of education and achievement that can enable them to succeed in the modern world. For example, every year or two, the United Nations publishes something called the Arab Human Development Report, which has pointed out time and again that any one nation in Europe translates more books from other languages into their languages than all the Arab nations collectively translate from other languages into Arabic. In other words, the European nations are intellectually curious, intellectually energetic. They're trying to learn from the whole world.
Number of patents that produce all these things.
You look where the Nobel Prizes are won.
Yeah.
That has not been something that the Arab nations have done to nearly the same degree. the solution to that problem, of course, is to increase or even maximize the degree to which the populations in the Islamic nations are given opportunities and encouragement
But you're saying
to
the
gain a modern education.
Yeah, but you're saying the leadership is not willing or able to do this. So what's going on there? Do they have a stake in keeping this festering population angry and embittered?
Well,
and
I'd say in general, and this applies not just to the Islamic community, it
Right,
applies to
right.
any nation on earth
Right.
that is tyrannical or that has a dictatorship. Dictatorships tend to feel very threatened by having an educated population, because education leads to democracy. In fact, it's a prerequisite for democracy, but it also is a stimulus to democracy. Once people become educated, they realize they don't need to be told how to behave by other people. They know how to live and how to do things. So dictatorships are scared of education, and they will inhibit it as much as possible. But I think that to the degree that some of the Arab nations, at least, are beginning to open themselves up to modern educational practices, I think that over time, and maybe it will take a generation or more, it seems to me that at least is a prerequisite for moving toward democracy, away from dictatorship, and therefore away from this hypersensitivity to feeling insulted or looked at as inferior.
And you personally were involved in a semester, right, at NYU Satellite Campus at Abu Dhabi, essentially taking what, the best and brightest of Muslim world and trying to educate them in a way that can liberate the people?
Yes, New York University has a satellite campus in Abu Dhabi, pardon me, Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. And my wife and I both taught there in the spring term last year. And I wanted to do that because I thought that there is nothing that is more needed in that part of the world than a modern education, a liberal education that will expose the students to ideas from all over the world. The students, by the way, weren't just from Arab countries. They were from 100 different countries.
Okay.
And they were some of the best and the brightest of the graduating high school students from all over the world. But what I was impressed by was that the Abu Dhabi government was open to the idea of inviting in a group of educators from the Western world to provide an education there. And of course, many of the students were from the United Arab Emirates and other Arab countries. But they weren't limited to that.
What was the course you taught? What was it called?
I taught two courses, one on the causes and prevention of violence, and one on shame and guilt in culture and personality. And these are closely related because, as I've said,
as you know,
I believe that the main essential, necessary cause of violence is the feeling of vulnerability to being shamed and humiliated. And particularly when people feel they don't have nonviolent means available to them to overcome an insult or to be invulnerable to it. Education is a nonviolent means of maintaining self-esteem, even if somebody else is trying to insult you or is treating you with contempt.
So I'm very curious as to students' reaction to the course.
The students loved it. I mean, they were wonderful students. They were interested. They were intellectually curious. They were eager to learn. Also, as I said, these were among the brightest students from all over the world. They were often very well educated themselves, even before they started college. And it was a pleasure teaching them. And as I said, I mean, I know NYU came under some criticism about the treatment with which some of the subcontractors who were building the campus there, the way some of the laborers had been treated, which was against the contract that NYU had with the contractors, and which NYU quickly changed once they learned about it. So I think, unfortunately, it's sort of like the old adage that no good deed goes unpunished. I mean, I think NYU has been doing something very worthwhile and very commendable there.
And these are the sorts of efforts you would really recommend to expand these
all over the world.
All over the world.
And in fact, many
as a solution are beginning to get people to be less violent, less prone to violence.
And also, it seems to me education on a global scale is a necessary means if we're going to have the possibility of understanding each other throughout the world. We have to have some kind of common frame of reference or frames of reference if we're going to be able to understand each other and communicate with each other. And to me, education is the royal road to, to achieving that. That's why I'm pleased that many Western universities are opening satellite branches all over the world, not just in the United Arab Emirates, but in nations throughout the world. And that's not at all to say, the advanced Western nations are going to bring their goods to these backward people. We have as much to learn from them as vice versa about their traditions, their cultures, and so on. And I think it's absolutely essential that we learn, all of us, to treat each other with respect. For people from the West to treat Islam and Islamic peoples with respect, and for them to treat us with respect. If we can't do that, we are in for another generation of out-of-control violence.
I'm glad you pointed it out. I think that's very important. And you use the same technique, right? Developing educational programs in prison, which has had unbelievable positive results, right?
In the Massachusetts prison system, I was running the prison mental health service there for all the prisoners in the state. I did a study one year of what program had been most effective in preventing violent reoffending after these violent criminals left the prison. And we found one program that had been 100% successful in preventing recurrences or recidivism of violent crimes for over a 25-year period. And that was prisoners who got a college degree while in prison. Professors from Boston University and some other local colleges were volunteering their time to teach college credit courses in the Massachusetts prisons. And between 200 and 300 different prisoners got a degree over this 25-year period. Not one of them reoffended after they got out. I thought at first we'd made a mistake and missed people. So we checked with the FBI about prison admissions all over the country. And they had not been admitted anywhere else either. And then I discovered some other states had found the same phenomenon. The state of Indiana had the same result. Folsom State Prison in California had the same result. And nothing's 100% forever everywhere. But studies throughout the country, right up to the present day, have been showing repeatedly the most effective single way to prevent violence is to give people an education, or make education available to them. Of course, people can only educate themselves, but you have to make it available first. And once you do that, nothing is more powerful in increasing people's sense of pride in themselves, self-respect, self-esteem, which are the major antidotes to violence, than getting an education. The moment you learn things, the moment you develop skills and acquire knowledge, you can respect that in yourself, other people respect it in you, and you become much less vulnerable to the emotional causes of violence. And it worked. I mean, I think we can say we empirically showed that. The usual recidivism rate in our state prisons after people leave the prison is 65% of prisoners reoffend within 3 years. Here we had 0% over a 25-year period. What was terrible was after I described this result in a public lecture I gave at Harvard University, our new governor, who was, a right-wing law and order type who had gotten elected to office on the campaign promise to reintroduce prisoners to the joys of busting rocks. I mean, he just wanted to punish them endlessly, pointlessly. He gave a press conference and said that he had not realized we offered a free college education to prisoners. We should shut that program down because otherwise people who were too poor to go to college would start committing crimes so they could be sent to prison to get a free college education.
And you were coddling them.
Yeah, that we were coddling them. So in the name of law and order, he succeeded in shutting down the most effective single program that we have discovered yet for making the community safer and reducing the rate of crime and violence. But it didn't happen just in Massachusetts. The entire Republican Congress, after the Newt Gingrich revolution, in 1994, succeeded in getting a Republican majority in the House of Representatives. The Congress repealed the program throughout the country called the Pell Grants, named for Senator Claiborne Pell, which provided free tuition and college textbooks for prisoners all over the United States.
Right.
They shut that down in the prisons, the Republican Congress then under Newt Gingrich. So in the name of law and order, the Republicans and our Republican governor in Massachusetts had succeeded in closing down the most effective programs for actually making the community safer, increasing law and order, and decreasing the level of criminal violence in our communities. Go figure.
So it sounds like they're in the following in the footsteps of some of the more authoritarian leaders in the Middle East as well, having a stake in non-educating the masses of people, in a sense, keep them ignorant, and feed. And these are people, who is running for vice president, right? He's a vice president candidate on the Libertarian Party.
Yes,
he's a highly educated person, right? You've met him, you know him. So he knows better, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he knows at some level. He intellectually, rationally knows better.
Oh, I think the man who did this was William Weld, who is now running for vice president on the Libertarian ticket.
Right.
Obviously knows that what he said was nonsense.
Right.
But he was also smart enough to know that he could win votes from voters whose attitude toward crime was lock up all the criminals, throw away the key, no amount of punishment is too much. Don't worry about whether this is making the community safer or not. It is satisfying our wish for vengeance and revenge on these people because we don't like what they did, and they can be great scapegoats for whatever else we don't like in our society.
So that goes back to some of your writings, right, about retribution, revenge, issues of morality, shame and guilt. Tell us a little bit about how your work has evolved here now in explaining the sort of personality, the political leaders that are attracted to this, and how we go beyond and transform our world and these leaders.
Well, I'd say one way that I think about this is the concept of what's been called the authoritarian personality syndrome, the collection or constellation of personality traits that make people potential fascists. After the close of World War II, a group of psychologists decided to do research to try to understand what could conceivably had led so many individuals and voters, as well as political leaders, in the European nations to become fascists before and during World War II. So they identified a constellation of attitudes and personality traits that predicted fascism. The work they did initially has been refined and made more and more sophisticated in the decades since then. It is now a well-respected, I'd say agreed upon
work,
body of research. And I would say that if you were going to describe the terrorist personality or the right-wing political personality, the kind of leadership that is represented, for example, by Donald Trump in his campaign, you're talking about authoritarian personalities. And you're also talking about them when you talk about dictators in the Middle East or in anywhere else, or potential dictators in this country. We're talking about authoritarian personalities who say they are going to be the authorities. They don't believe in democracy. Authoritarianism is the opposite of egalitarianism or equality. Democracy means equality of power. The term itself means rule by the people, right. Democracy. And it requires equality among the voters.
Yeah. Trump prides himself to a certain extent on not being that educated in a sense. That
he said he loves uneducated people. I'll tell you something. I love uneducated people too. Mm-hmm. I also love educated people. And in a larger sense, I love people.
Right.
What makes me angry is the fact that Trump is deceiving the very people that he says he loves. He's deceiving them deliberately and successfully.
Deliberately, consciously.
Deliberately, consciously, and successfully. I am not going to say that I blame the people that get fooled by him. They may not know any better. The fact is, they are voting against their own self-interest if they vote for Trump. They're not doing that consciously or deliberately. They don't realize it. What I think we need to do is to try to raise the consciousness of the political consciousness of voters in this country so people can realize if you vote for Trump, you're voting against democracy, you're voting against the self-interest of everybody except the richest 1% or the richest 1% of 1%. That is the only group that's going to benefit even temporarily from a Trump presidency.
And perpetuating violence.
Absolutely.
By the very policies, right? We must remain, quote, strong, macho, hit them back.
Yep.
Again, the shame culture that I'd like you to talk a little more about that Trump represents, producing then the same ill feelings on the other side. So this cycle continues. This cancer continues. And you try to break that pattern here through your work.
The more inequality there is in a country, and this has been studied all over the world, the greater the degree of inequality in power and in wealth between the powerful and wealthy on the one hand and the weak and the poor on the other hand. The greater that gap is, the higher the rate of violence there is in the society. Mm-hmm. That's been true in America over all the years that we've studied this, and it's true in countries around the world. That is the danger of a Trump presidency. Is the effect of electing him would be to increase the inequality in our society. His tax policies and other economic policies and other social policies would benefit the very, very rich, the richest of the rich, and would shortchange the middle class and the poor. And he is fooling people into thinking that that is not true. It's important for people to be educated about this, that he is the worst enemy of the middle class and everybody except the richest 1% of 1%.
Again, as a psychiatrist, so what Trump gets what out of this destructive interchange? He gets a feeling of what?
Well, I think Trump is a classical example of somebody who feels inadequate, inferior. Nobody brags about the size of his penis, for God's sake, unless he thinks his penis is not large enough. I mean, it's so primitive. Mm-hmm. It's so stupid, you know. And it's so transparently obvious. But, you know, that's what he does because he feels inferior.
And that's what the authoritarian.
Let me put it another way. I don't know Trump personally,
Right.
but I say anybody who does this.
Right.
I've worked with thousands of the most authoritarian and violent people our society produces, and I'm telling you, this is the way personality works.
And that's what Adorno found too in the authoritarian.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
in order to deal with the self-hate,
Yeah.
right? You what? You project it onto the other, to the scapegoat, and act in a way to deal with your own inadequacies.
That's right. The weaker you feel, the more you're going to say that other people are weak. I mean, that was how he insulted his rivals in the Republican primaries. You know, some of them he'd call weak. He had other terms, other ways of insulting people. The need to insult people is a sure sign that the person who's doing the insulting feels vulnerable to insult himself, is hypersensitive to issues of being insulted, just like the criminals I interviewed in the Massachusetts prisons, who were scared to death of being insulted or disrespected or ridiculed or whatever. I mean, Trump has exactly the same personality traits as one sees him on television, sees him quoted in the newspapers, and so on. Again, I don't know him personally. I haven't examined him. I'm talking about personality traits that have been studied, you know, among thousands and thousands of people and replicated in good empirical research.
What do you think you might find if you were able to examine the bomber here, the New York City bomber? What would you imagine was going on there?
All I can say is the traits that have been found in studies of bombers. One, terrorist bombers.
Right.
There's been a lot of work on terrorism, trying to understand the psychology of terrorists and the terrorist mentality by a variety of researchers. I'd say one issue on which there is something of a consensus is that people who resort to terrorism do so because they feel that the group with which they identify has been humiliated and shamed, and that violence is the only means they have, particularly terrorist violence, is the only means they have by which to restore their self-esteem and prove to themselves and the rest of the world how powerful they are. Now, terrorism has always been called the weapon of the weak, and it is, as you think about it. After all, when Osama's group flew the planes into the World Trade Center tower, that doesn't mean that as a group they had power anywhere close to the power of the United States government. Obviously they don't. They didn't have their own planes. They didn't have thermonuclear weapons. They didn't have tanks and an army and so on. What they were able to show is that a handful of men armed with nothing but box cutters could destroy the World Trade Center towers. They were the weak politically and militarily, but they were showing the whole world how they could humiliate the most powerful nation on earth as they saw it. To them, I think the purpose was to humiliate the U.S. People who respected...
To deal with their own humiliation.
To deal with their own.
Perceived
To try to undo their own humiliation by transferring it onto us. And that's the purpose of violence. The words for violence all actually refer to that. The words assault and injure. The word assault comes from the same Latin roots as the word insult. To assault somebody is to insult him, i.e. to shame him. And in fact, the word insult also means assault. Physicians refer to the surgical incision that a surgeon makes in the skin of a patient as the surgical insult. That's the assault on the skin.
The technical term.
So technically, insult means assault, and assault means insult.
Right.
Injure comes from the Latin word injuria, which in Latin means insult. It also means injury. But in other words, to injure somebody is to insult them, and to insult them is to injure them, either psychologically or physically. So the purpose of violence, again, whether it's physical violence or emotional and verbal violence, is to injure the other person by insulting them.
Violence generally, and then there are specific forms that the violence may take. In terms of corporal punishment of children, for example, I talk about this a lot in my classes, and many students have kids of their own, and they really insist that they learn to be good kids, grew up to be good law-abiding adults because they were corporally punished, beaten at times, or certainly spanked, and they're convinced that that is the only way to do this. Now, you're not saying that these parents here are vicious and malicious and have isn't this out of love that they're doing to these kids, or what's going on there?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to pretend to read the minds of all the parents in the world, including all those who believe in corporal punishment. What I will say is this. First of all, we have, at least 60 years, probably more than that, of research on child development. Now, child development, and this is research on child rearing and how it affects child development. Now, these subjects are so complicated. There's so many different variables involved in parents raising children. You can't possibly control for all the variables and do the most rigorous research. Out of this confusion of data, there is one finding that has come through so consistently that it is the most firmly supported finding from all this research on child development and child rearing, and that is the more severely children are punished, the more violent they become, both as children and as adults.
Strong correlation.
Absolutely. The strongest of any variable in all that literature. I found this when I worked with the violent criminals in the prisons. These were the most severely abused as children of any population I had ever seen or even realized existed.
Right.
So we know that corporal punishment only stimulates violence. It does not inhibit it. Now, I'm not saying that parents deliberately know this. I think they need to be educated about this. I think they don't know this, or they most likely wouldn't do it. What I have been, I would say, amused by, except it's not amusing, it's sad, is when I've given lectures on this, I've had sometimes people in the audience stand up and say, well, they would challenge my notion that there is a generational cycle of violence. That if the parents abuse the children are likely to abuse their own children, and they'll abuse their children, and so forth. And I'm referring to corporal punishment as a form of abuse. All I mean by it is the use of inflicting physical pain on somebody else, okay? Doing to a child what would be considered an act of assault and battery if one adult did the same thing to another adult. Okay. I've had people stand up in the audience and say, well, there can't be a generational cycle of violence from one generation to the other, because my parents punished me physically when I was a child, and it didn't hurt me, so that's why I do it to my child. Without realizing, they're saying exactly what I was saying.
They are perpetuating.
I mean, that's what we have found repeatedly.
Right.
The United States is a country where our courts, up to the highest level, including the Supreme Court, have permitted corporal punishment of children, not only by parents, but also by teachers, babysitters, other adults. The countries of Western Europe, many of them, have passed laws against the corporal punishment of children, since it is assault and battery if committed on another adult. So they're saying we should treat children with at least as much consideration and respect as we treat other adults. The United States is among the few countries in the developed world, the economically developed world, that has not done that yet. So I agree. I think corporal punishment of children is a huge mistake, and I think it's important to try to educate people about this.
So this complex interaction and attempts to understand what forms violence might take. We've got your ideas that certainly the central cause, in a sense, is shame and disrespect, humiliation. But as you pointed out, we all, to a certain extent, get shamed and humiliated. So there's no obvious direct correlation here. How do you then tease out, the independent variables and in terms of deciding how to protect one against collective violence, or a country or a community, which is, of course, what we're facing now.
Yeah.
How do you break this cycle, or how can you help us understand?
Well, let me say, first of all, that violence is multi-determined.
Right.
It's not caused by any one factor. Shame, as I said, is a necessary cause, but it's not a sufficient one.
Okay.
In the same way that the tubercle bacillus, the bacterium that causes tuberculosis, is a necessary cause of tuberculosis, but it's not sufficient. Simply exposing people to the bacteria alone doesn't cause tuberculosis, because many people exposed to the bacteria don't come down with tuberculosis because they have an immune system that fights it off. So we know that other factors need to be present.
Intervening variables.
Yeah, they're additional. They're additive variables.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So heredity is one. If you have inherited a strong immune system or a weak system, that will affect whether you get tuberculosis. Are you poor? Meaning, do you have access to medical care? Do you live in overcrowded housing? Do you live in a place where you're exposed to a lot of other people who have tuberculosis, and so on? These social factors can influence whether you get tuberculosis. And psychological factors. Are you an alcoholic or a drug addict? I mean, these kinds of things predispose you to becoming sick, even if without them you wouldn't. So I'd say the same is true of violence. Yes, being humiliated is a necessary cause, but it's not sufficient. Because, as you said, we're all subjected to insults or ridicule at one time or another, but most of us never commit a serious act of violence in our lifetimes. So clearly other factors have to be present. One of the most important, I'd say, is lack of access to nonviolent means of undoing humiliation and restoring one's self-esteem. And as I said earlier, education is one of the most powerful of the nonviolent means of overcoming humiliation without violence. People only resort to violence as a last resort. Even the most violent people only use violence for seconds in their lifetime. They may live for 1 million seconds or 100 million seconds, but the amount of time even the most violent people spend actually committing violence is going to be seconds in this huge amount of time they live on Earth. People only resort to violence if they think that's the only means by which they can undo humiliation and respect and disrespect. So that applies individually and collectively. That's why it is so important that we encourage and try to assist and help every country on Earth to provide as much education as possible for all of its citizens, as much opportunity to achieve economic equality with the richest of their membership as is possible all over the world. The more we have economic inequality, inequalities of power, inequalities of knowledge, and knowledge is power, and wealth is power. So these are all different ways of saying the same thing. The more we can reduce these inequalities, the less violent a world we'll have. If we don't do things, whatever we can, to enable people to be more equal, both politically and economically, if we don't help them, we're just asking for more of the same. If we do help them, we can live in a world in which people will not be killing each other at remotely the same rates that they do now.
And you also talk about the issues of love and feeling alive and the awe and wonder of life that, in your clinical experience, has often not been present in the people you were dealing with. So tell us a little about that necessity. Love as the oxygen for life.
What I found is that the most violent people that I worked with in the prisons would tell me something I had not heard about before. I hadn't read about it anywhere. I just learned it from them. They said they had died long before they started killing other people. And I asked them what they meant. They meant their personality had died. They felt dead inside. They felt empty. They used words to describe themselves that referred to the living dead, like zombie or vampire or robot. They would cut themselves or mutilate themselves, not to punish themselves. They didn't feel guilty about the crimes they'd committed. They found it more tormenting to feel numb and dead than even to feel physical pain if they could. They would cut themselves and then describe, even that did not let them have feelings. They had neither physical sensations nor emotional feelings. And they felt like the living dead. I refer to this as the death of the self. When I would review the history of their lives, what I would find time after time was they could identify a point at which they felt deadened. And it was invariably a moment of extreme, overwhelming humiliation and shame in the sense that they felt they were totally unloved, unrespected, unvalued, that their existence wasn't valued by anybody on earth, mainly and most importantly their own parents.
What a devastating experience to have that.
So what I would say is, we know how to create a psychopath, that is a person who is utterly without a conscience, without a capacity for feelings of guilt and remorse about hurting other people, and without a capacity to love other people. And I'd say ultimately without a capacity for self-love. We know how to create such a person. And the way you do it is you deprive the person of love. You have them, they've had the bad luck to be born into a family where no adult has had the capacity to love them. They grow up to become psychopaths, and they then become dangerous to all of us. I'm not saying that all of them do.
Right.
Some of them kill themselves rather than other people. Some of them find other ways to destroy their lives through drugs or alcohol or whatever. But of those who become violent, I'd say the most violent among them invariably conform to this pattern. So yes, love is as essential to the self, to that psychological construct we call the self, as oxygen is to the body. The self dies when it's deprived of love, just like the body dies when it's deprived of oxygen.
So that as our friend calls it, radical love, is so necessary within the person. And in cultures become morally numb, in a sense, or as Cornel West puts it, morally constipated, if you will. Are we at the stage in world history now that we're in the middle of this, or how do we break free of the moral numbness, the coldness that we seem to be experiencing as a world, the heartlessness, if you will?
Well, I say again, I wouldn't characterize all the world as being the same.
Sure.
I mean, there are different camps, you know.
Sure. I'm overgeneralizing.
What I would say is this, that one important way to communicate love and to diminish the degree to which people feel that they are unloved and nobody cares about them is to provide a comprehensive welfare state, which makes sure that nobody is permitted to become poor or to become homeless or to be deprived of medical care or deprived of a college or higher education and so on. You know, it all boils down to something that the Russian novelist Dostoevsky wrote about in his greatest novel, The Brothers Karamazov. He has the old Russian monk and priest, Father Zosima, describe a world in which, as he says, all are responsible for all, meaning all human beings are responsible for all other human beings. We are all responsible for each other. The only way a society can communicate that is through the government, and through, in a democracy, of course, the government is the people, and the people are the government. If the people, through the government, can provide help for everybody and take responsibility for everybody's welfare, people are not going to be feeling as unloved because they are not as unloved.
Right.
That's why the countries with the best welfare states, the countries in Western Europe, and the other English-speaking democracies like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, have the most effective welfare states and the lowest levels of murder in the entire world. The U.S. has the highest rates of murder in the developed world, and we have the lowest rates of governmental and collective support for people. We have much more poverty, for example, than any of the other developed countries. So no wonder our murder rates run 5 to 10 times higher than those of the other developed countries on Earth.
Political parties seem, on both sides, Democrats, major political parties, don't seem to get this or be able to put this together in a way that is coherent, that can appeal to the great mass of the people. How can we get this message across politically to the political structures? Is it possible at this point? Or do we need to have movements on the Reverend Barber's moral mandate movement and so on?
These things are complicated because
right.
in a democracy, I said the democracy is the government and vice versa. And in a sense, that's true. In a sense, it's not true. Of course, the government is dependent on the voters. The government consists of whoever the voters put into office. But once people are put into office, they affect the voters. I don't think it's fair to the Democrats to say that they've not done this at all. Compared to the Republicans, the Democrats have provided much more support and help for the poor. They've done much more to create equality, political and economic, than the Republicans have. However, even the Democrats in this country have not done that nearly as successfully as the left-wing or social democratic countries have done in Western Europe or in the other English-speaking democracies. Even the Democratic Party in this country is more conservative than some of the conservative parties in some of these other countries. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, I think it's very important not to equate the Democrats with the Republicans. Mm-hmm. Everything in politics is relative. Relative to the Republicans, the Democrats have pursued policies that since the year 1900, when we first started measuring death rates each year by cause, I have found, using the government's own statistics, this isn't my data, the government's own data, from the death certificates of everybody who's died in America since 1900, the rates of both homicide and suicide have increased dramatically when Republicans have entered the White House during Republican administrations. And
happens. Rates of violence too.
I'm talking about violence.
Right. And
I'm talking about homicide and suicide rates. Increase under Republicans and decrease equally dramatically under Democrats. Okay. And that's been true since 1900. If you graph the yearly increases and decreases in homicide and suicide over those years, from 1900 to 2010, we had 60 years of Republican administrations and 50 of Democratic. The rate of suicide and homicide under Republicans just goes up cumulative year after year after year. The rate under Democrats goes down cumulatively year after year after year, with slight wiggles, because it'll vary a little bit from one year to the next. But the overall cumulative trend is clearly, just dramatically down, down, down. The longer the Democrats, the greater the cumulative number of years Democrats have been in office, the more the rates of suicide and homicide have gone down. The opposite's true for Republicans.
And I think our time is also wiggling away here. We get the point, and It's a tremendous lesson for all of us to appreciate, and thank you so very, very much here on the Radical Imagination. It's been James Gilligan. My name is Jim Vrettos. I'm your host, and we'll see you again next week on the Radical Imagination.